What's up, vetters? Patrick here with Vetted. We are going to be covering a Chris Mellon presentation that he gave at the Vail Symposium not too far back, but I thought it was worth covering because I didn't get to cover it originally when it came out. And honestly, Chris Mellon said some things in it that I found to be quite interesting. And I feel like this just kind of got glossed over in the community, myself included. So let's take a look at a couple clips from Chris Mellon speaking at the Vail Symposium about UAP. And as we go along, I'll kind of break down a little bit of what he's saying and what I think about it, right? Of course, as always, leave your comments down below. And please, vetters, don't forget to like this video. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Y'all put out daily videos about the UAP phenomena. So if that's something that is of interest to you, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Let's go, y'all.
So at that point, I contacted my friends on the Armed Services Intelligence Committees, asked them, I said, I know this sounds crazy, but please listen to what these guys have to say. We brought then the Navy pilots in, and that's what really worked. Those were the guys that had the credibility. So when the Navy pilots came in and ran through their experiences and talked the senators through this, and they began to see some of the other evidence. And of course, they're also then able to get some of the classified information that complements, reinforces, expands on some of this. There are lots of other videos. So, for example, this is one of numerous F-18 cockpit at-flare videos. I've seen some of the others. And why they're not released to the public, so I was investigated for having released these, and the Air Force Office of Special Investigations confirmed this was unclassified, didn't compromise national security. I would argue that it advanced national security because it made us aware of a potential threat that wasn't being addressed so that we could begin working to close that vulnerability. And yet they have, I don't know at this point, how many dozens like this that they still haven't released. So the executive order on classification says, when in doubt, you should make it unclassified. And I can't imagine what lawful basis they have for classifying that after they publicly acknowledged that this did not damage national security. And that's a small example of a larger issue. So the new CIA director, when he was director of national intelligence, acknowledged on CNN that we have satellite imagery of UAP. And I've seen some of that as well. And some of that is even more compelling, perhaps. These infrared videos tend to be fuzzy. One of these interesting, notice there's kind of like a halo around this object. And the theory that some scientists in the community have to try to explain this method of propulsion that we're seeing is that space-time is being manipulated. Space-time itself is being manipulated in the immediate vicinity of the craft. And therefore, the craft is not feeling any acceleration. And therefore, of course, it's not getting hot. And it would explain a range of things that we're seeing if it's indeed possible. Theoretically, there's something called an Alcubierre drive, which the physics community is still refining, but it does demonstrate if you had sufficient energy, it would be possible to do that. It's way beyond the bounds of anything we could recreate at this time. It's truly, theoretical physics. But there are some theories about how this might be done if you had a much more advanced civilization with more advanced understanding of science.
And before I go any further, I do want to give a quick shout out to Neil Goodman here on Twitter, who turned me on to this clip and therefore, turned me on to going down this rabbit hole and looking into all this. So shout out to Neil Goodman. I'll put a link in the description to his post about this. All right. So I think more than anything, what I learned from this particular clip, and stay with me because I've got one more that's really interesting, but it's Chris Mellon saying, first of all, talking about John Ratcliffe, mentioning the, satellite imagery and how some of that should be released, and, spoke about it on CNN. I actually went and looked for that clip, and I couldn't find anything on CNN, but I did find something on Fox News, and I'll play that clip in just a second. But I did want to say that it was interesting to hear Chris Mellon say that he's also seen, right, this imagery, right, that is far better than anything that has been released, right? And I think that is something I've heard before in this community from other people, right? Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, I mean, to name just a few, right? There are quite a few more. And it makes me think that's true, right? I mean, that's probably exactly what's going on, that some of this stuff just can't be released, but other people have seen it, and it becomes hard, right, to sort of generate a sort of enthusiasm about the phenomena when you've seen stuff that other people have and you can't really talk about it, but you want to talk about it. You know, I get it. It's a fine line for sure, right? So, but that's interesting, right? Will this stuff ever get released? I mean, even Chris Mellon sort of agrees that why isn't it declassified? What are the reasons why this isn't getting out? It could be, right? So there's really no reason to keep it hidden, right? Just get the information out, right? And maybe this new administration, they've made a lot of promises about, releasing some of this information. So hopefully that does happen. But now let me get to this clip that I mentioned earlier that I found. Again, I didn't find it on Fox News and Chris Mellon, CNN. I couldn't find that clip, and maybe it existed. Maybe he just misspoke and he meant Fox News. But this is from about 4 years ago, from 2021, of John Ratcliffe talking about UAP. And I think this is what Chris Mellon was referring to. Take a look.
John, you have seen in your role the most intelligence that anybody has seen other than the president as the director of national intelligence. Can you tell us, have unidentified flying objects been seen?
Well, sure. We have lots of reports about what we call unidentified aerial phenomenon. And this actually is a program that's been in place for a few years in terms of a task force that has been there under the National Defense Authorization Act. But as you correctly point out, Maria, there's now a report that will be issued by the Pentagon, by the Secretary of Defense and the Director of National Intelligence. But frankly, there are a lot more sightings than have been made public. Some of those have been declassified. When we talk about sightings, we're talking about objects that have been seen by Navy or Air Force pilots or have been picked up by satellite imagery that frankly engage in actions that are difficult to explain, that movements that are hard to replicate, that we don't have the technology for, or traveling at speeds that exceed the sound barrier without a sonic boom. When that information becomes declassified, I'll be able to talk a little bit more about that.
Can you tell us where it was seen?
Actually, all over the world. There have been sightings all over the world. And when we talk about sightings, the other thing I will tell you is it's not just a pilot or just a satellite or some intelligence collection. Usually we have multiple sensors that are picking up these things. And so, again, some of this are just they're unexplained phenomenon. And there's actually quite a few more than have been made public. So I think it'll be healthy for as much of this information to get out there as possible so that the American people can see some of the things that we've been dealing with.
And now let's get to another interesting clip from Chris Mellon's speech at the Vail Symposium. I think you're going to find this interesting as well.
It also explains why it's hard to get clear, crisp pictures, because if there is an area in the immediate vicinity of the craft where space-time is distorted, then the signals from radar and so forth, or photons that are entering that field and being emanated from it, may change. It may change the rate, the frequency, and that kind of thing. So this is speculative, but some of the attempts that are being made as some of our scientists are scratching their heads and trying to figure out how this might be done, those are some of the ideas they're kicking around.
I've got about 20 questions in less than 20
Yeah,
minutes.
this is about, I'm going to be near the end here.
So here's what I want to ask you first. You made reference, and let's run through them real fast. Okay?
Sure.
You referred back in the 1950s to flying saucers, but we have much more imagery since the 1950s. What are the various visual characteristics of UAPs?
Right, so this is really interesting because there's sort of certain families that we see consistently. So for example, there are triangular craft, and I just happen to have a slide here. Oh, there it goes. So this was reported by a Navy officer stationed in Hampton Roads, Virginia. And he contacted me through LinkedIn, and he wanted to know how to get this information to this new, at this time there was a task force on UAP that had just been established, and he wanted to know how to get this information to them. And he was driving with his sunroof open, and he looked up and he saw this thing flying over his car. And it was moving slightly faster, but not much faster than his car. So he got a really good look at it for a period of several minutes. And he did this very detailed sketch. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this is that people all over the world report almost exactly the same thing, and they have been since at least the 60s, probably the 50s. Almost always a light in each corner, almost always black, almost always at night, almost always light in the center, almost always soundless and low and slow. And let's see here, so here's an article from 1960, and you can see this report that made the newspapers, and you can see how closely this object resembles the object that this Navy officer reported in 2017, half a century later. And in fact, there were many other reports of this kind, and there's a considerable amount of raw data on this in terms of letters, hand-drawn sketches from that period. So triangles, lately, a new phenomenon, I want to talk about the drones a little bit, but triangles, orbs, like balls of light, we don't see this so much anymore, but fireballs, the occasional these white tic-tac craft, and nobody knows if they have a common source or different sources, and their behaviors are somewhat different. Sometimes they're like in the Phoenix Lights, they're more of a boomerang-shaped thing.
In your opinion, when there are credible UAP sightings, is there an inarguable corollary with extraterrestrial beings? Even, I'll ask, at the controls.
My first thought about that, my inclination has always been to think that if there is an extraterrestrial connection, it's probably some kind of AI. It's probably not biological. We can see the trajectory of where our own technology is going. We already have craft that have left the solar system, Voyager 2, Voyager 1. We can see where this is going with AI right now.
I think there's a lot of great points here that Chris Mellon makes, right? 3 in particular, all right? So let's start with number 1. One, he states may be hard to get pictures of these craft or video because of particular technology that they may have that may distort the surrounding area around them or the craft itself. And look, if we're talking about aliens and extraterrestrial civilizations, as hard as it is to sort of wrap your mind around, it's still a possibility that is the case, right? We may not like it because we want crisp pictures and, don't give me that BS. Of course, you could take a picture of it. Well, but if we're talking about technologies we don't know, to be fair, right, it seems a little disingenuous to say that's not possible, right? Because as human beings, we actually don't know what's not possible. We may think we do, right? We may say, well, this isn't possible. That's not what we actually don't know. If we don't have all the knowledge in the universe or just all the knowledge period, then how can we know what's not possible or even what's possible? That's the point. And I get it. It makes it a little murky, right? So for me, it's still a possibility. Now, what are the probabilities of it? I don't know, right? It's honestly almost impossible to quantify, right? So anyway, that's kind of an interesting point from Chris Mellon, which I've heard many times. And again, still remains a possibility. All right, point number 2, right? It's the idea of people wanting to report these cases, right? Which will lead me to point number 3, right? But pilots, other people that want to report this stuff, there's really no direct system. There's a lot of different ways to report, but no, this is the way. Hey, did you report this to XYZ? There is no thing. There's a bazillion ways. You could put it on Reddit. You could put it online. You could go to a journalist. You could go to a YouTube channel. You could go to maybe Congress or even Arrow or this or that or MUFON or what. But there's, you know what I mean? It's kind of just all over the place. I mean, so it makes it difficult, and I realize that, right? And there should be a better system, and one in particular, like the main one, the Apex system. Maybe that's it. That's what we call it, Apex. This is the place where you come to report it for everyone across the world, right? I don't know. Now let's get to point number 3, which leads me from point number 2, right? Which is this new Hampton Triangle case that I'd never heard of, right? And Chris Mellon gets reached out to on LinkedIn, right? Again, just another way to get it out, because you think, well, I need to go to the guy who knows about this stuff and let me give it to him directly. And that's not a good system, right? Sending messages directly. I mean, I get messages every single day of, I've got the smoking gun, I've got this, right? And then you see it and it's just literally a dot in the sky or nothing in the video, right? And then people get upset that you don't treat it with what they feel is, the intensity or emotional response they're expecting from you about it, right? Because maybe there's just nothing there, right? And that's kind of the point, right? But Chris Mellon clearly thought that this Hampton Triangle case, which is interesting, right, on its own, is worth sharing and worth getting around, right? But things like that can get lost in the mail, if you will, right? Because it can go to spam, it can go to junk, you have so many, you can't get through it, right? Which is why we do need a better unified, one system, one place where people go. And to be fair, I don't know if that's ever going to happen, but ideally that would be the best. So what did y'all think about this case, the Hampton Triangle, right? And what he mentions about, ships or whatever cases, right, that look like that, right? This triangle with the light in each corner and a light in the middle. And that is a very well-known type of craft that is seen all over. Does that mean it's extraterrestrial? I don't know. There's definitely a lot of advanced technology that we've developed that looks similar, right? Could that be what everyone is seeing around the world? That also seems not plausible, right? But then you also have to consider the fact that these stories are out there makes it easy for people to replicate the stories. Does that make sense? And sort of BS you, right? Because they can just say something they've already, a story that's already out, and then just copy it and say the same thing, right? Ideally, you would want all of this in a bubble where people haven't heard this information before and are talking about it, right? Because unfortunately, that is sort of a tripwire, right? Knowing anytime you hear, well, see this, that's like this story from here before, right? And that's what people expect you to say. Oh, this reminds me of this story and that story and this story, right? See, maybe there is something to it, but you have no idea if those people have been influenced by those other stories, and whether it's subconsciously or consciously, right? And that does become an issue. Again, just the spider web of information and data about this that makes it very hard. But one thing, all right, this will be my final point here. One thing I am sure of is that there are definitely things flying around that we just don't know what they are. And that will always remain something we need to look into. Now, what they are, that is yet to be determined and may forever be that way. So anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. I'll put links in the description. Thanks again for watching here till the end. We'll see you on the next video, vetters. Remember, every day's a gift, y'all. Peace.